Is gut-directed hypnotherapy really as effective as a low FODMAP diet? Let's find out. So I downloaded this study here. It's from 2016. It was conducted with the Monash University. They discovered and kind of pioneered the low FODMAP diet. The Monash app is really helpful, and the group that did this study was also part of that team. And they wanted to know, is hypnotherapy similar, better, worse than a low FODMAP diet? And low FODMAP stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. And, doing a low FODMAP diet has shown a lot of efficacy. It can lower gas, can be very helpful in the stomach. And so I want to take you through the study. The abstract is free online, but you actually have to pay to access this kind of information, which really holds people back from understanding what the study actually said. So if you just read the summary of the results here, the methods: irritable bowel syndrome patients were randomized on a computer-generated list to receive hypnotherapy, diet, or a combination of hypnotherapy and diet. The primary endpoint was change in overall gastrointestinal symptoms across the three groups from baseline to week 6. And secondary endpoints: changes in psychological indices and the durability of effects over 6 months. So how are you psychologically? How are you physically? And for the results, there were 74 participants. 25 received hypnotherapy, 24 received diet, and 25 received a combination of hypnotherapy and diet. There were no demographic differences at baseline, and improvements for overall symptoms were observed at baseline to week 6 for hypnotherapy, a combination, and diet, and there were no differences across the group. Now, this was a small study, and if you want to see differences across groups, you typically need a much bigger study. So this study of just 74 people, because the effect wasn't really big, or the difference wasn't very big, it's going to be hard to find if there is actually a difference. So that's one pitfall of this study. And they've also found that those who are actually just doing hypnotherapy had superior improvements on psychological indices, and that was significant for anxiety, depression, and quality of, and the groups all similarly improved for quality of life. And so they concluded that there's durable effects of gut-directed hypnotherapy, similar to those of the low FODMAP diet. And hypnotherapy was superior compared to the diet on psychological indices. So you may think that that's great news, and I think it's good news to know that there's nuance with the gut-brain axis, right? But we want to know, how far can we actually generalize this research, right? So they go through the introduction, which if you want to learn more about irritable bowel syndrome, you can do, and the methods. They were in Melbourne at the university and recruited people there that were over 18 years old that were not already on a low FODMAP diet. They also randomized people to gut-directed hypnotherapy. Now, if you just read the top, I read you everything that was there. What is gut-directed hypnotherapy, right? What did they actually do to find that it was as effective as the low FODMAP diet? Well, there were 6 weekly 1-hour sessions for 6 weeks. This is word for word. And then education on a low FODMAP diet at the beginning of the week 1, and a review at week 6. Or they did a combination of both. They also looked at long-term gastrointestinal symptoms, psychological symptoms, and dietary adherence. Right. So the low FODMAP diet, they worked with a dietitian for 1-hour sessions on the low FODMAP diet at the beginning, at the end of 1 week. And they were asked to restrict foods containing high FODMAPs and moderate amounts of all FODMAPs, and to consume only foods that contain no or low amounts of FODMAPs. They were given written information outlining the principles of the diet, lists of high, moderate, and low FODMAP containing foods, instructions on how to read food labels for FODMAPs, and several recipe ideas. Participants were instructed to follow the diet strictly from beginning of week 1 to the end of week 6. Weekly telephone contact was made to encourage compliance. Participants were not permitted to discuss additional matters during this contact. So they actually weren't able to talk about any other matters except for like how the diet was going, which is interesting. That's, I think, with the biopsychosocial approach, that I know it's not something that they have time for in the system in 15-minute or 30-minute interactions with your clinical team, but as somebody who works more one-on-one with people, to help spend the time and really answer some of these other questions can be really helpful. So at 6 weeks, the participants underwent a review of the current best practices, And those who had symptomatic improvement were educated on the reintroduction phase. So those that actually got better were taught how to bring FODMAPs back into their diet at the end of 6 weeks. Okay? And those that failed to show improvement were instructed to return previously excluded foods back into the diet. So the foods, FODMAPs, these are all healthful plants. And if you're not getting results within 6 weeks, and you're actually following the low FODMAP diet, which is easier said than done, if you're actually following the low FODMAP diet, not getting improvements, that's when they're encouraged to just go back to the low FODMAP diet. And the reintroduction phase is to basically liberalize the diet while maintaining good symptomatic control for best practices. So each person would reintroduce one FODMAP subgroup, oligo, di, mono, one of those. And reintroduction of oligosaccharides occurred more gradually, where one fructan-containing food was introduced per week. If symptoms were experienced, participants stopped the reintroduction and waited until they were symptom-free before reducing the serving size to half and trying again. Alternatively, participants could assume that the low FODMAP was a problem for them, or that the FODMAP was a problem for them, and continue on to the next FODMAP reintroduction. If symptoms were not experienced, they could either gradually increase the number of foods that contain the particular FODMAP they were challenging and continue to assess their response until the amount that they previously consumed was reached, or the amount and type of FODMAP in their diet, and continue on to the next FODMAP subgroup per reintroduction. This process was continued until each FODMAP subgroup was tested. Since individual participants differed with regard to tolerance levels to each FODMAP, the time taken to undergo the reintroduction phase varied. Information on each participant's FODMAP reintroduction phase was collected at the 6-month follow-up. So, essentially, every week they met with a dietitian who told them about the low FODMAP diet, gave them a plan, said you need to follow this very strictly for 6 weeks. You can't veer off this plan. And if it's working for you, then you can reintroduce one group at a time. If it's not working for you, then you might need to try something else, essentially. And that's really, I read that word for word, but that is the low FODMAP plan. It's a plan that I used myself. And it's really not super complicated. It's made very easy with the low FODMAP app through Monash. It's just $7, but it's the most worth it, $7, to just understand what contains FODMAPs, what causes gas, etc. And the combined treatment, those in the combined treatment receive both the gut-directed hypnotherapy and the low FODMAP diet treatment. So that's 6 weeks of an hour a day, every day, plus changing your diet. So that can be a lot to do together at once. And they wanted to understand the change in overall gastrointestinal symptoms across hypnotherapy, low FODMAP diet, and both over 6 weeks and then over 6 months as well. So let's go to the results. Of 146 individuals who responded to advertisements, 78 fulfilled the inclusion criteria and were enrolled. So again, this study, there are people, half of the people that were interested weren't even able to be in the study. So if you just take the general population, you can't necessarily apply this one-to-one, but there are people that this already doesn't apply to because they weren't able to be entered into the study, right? So you may have been excluded from the study, meaning this study wouldn't generalize to you. And so people withdrew throughout it, but there were really no difference in the demographic features, gastrointestinal symptoms, or psychological features as well. And so the adherence to the low FODMAP diet was achieved in 21 participants, or 88%, and 19 in the controlled group. And there were 3 accidental exposures to high FODMAP foods, but no participant abandoned the diet completely. So this is something that people do follow, and if you have chronic stomach pain like I had, like most people have, maybe 40% of people have some sort of GI issues, getting out of pain feels really good, and if it works, you're going to stick with it for a little bit. And so let's continue. We're going to look at the age here. So this was 40 was the average age. We have people from 20 to 72 as well. So the others are in their 60s. So if you're above 72, if you're 80, if you're 90, this also may not apply to you, but it might. We just don't have the research to understand that fully. So I do want to go to the charts here, and it makes it seem, if you're not familiar with research, if I just show you the photo, that combining a low FODMAP diet and hypnotherapy, calming, mindfulness, could actually give you worse outcomes than just doing hypnotherapy. And I can see how doing it the way that they did it in their program led to that outcome. But that doesn't necessarily mean that if you include breathing mindfulness practices in with reducing FODMAP so you're not in gastrointestinal pain all the time, that doesn't mean that it will necessarily be less effective. That just means that in this particular study, the way it was conducted, it was not as effective, partially because people probably felt overwhelmed, potentially. But let's just read through the discussion because I really love reading the discussion. So, the therapeutic approach in patients with IBS includes dietary, psychological, and pharmacological studies. Obtaining high-quality evidence for efficacy of psychological therapies can be challenging due to difficulties in designing appropriate placebo interventions. So, if you feel like you're doing something, if you're actually changing your diet, you might get better just because you're part of a program that's looking and monitoring your health. So they call that the Hawthorne effect. And I actually love that because if you're in a program, if you're working with a coach, no matter who the coach is, you're probably going to get healthier because we're monitoring your food, we're asking you how you're feeling on a daily basis, and we're coming up with a plan together. That's what's happening in studies as well. So if people are just in a study and someone's curious about what they're eating and how they're doing, they may just get healthier. And this study is not able to control for that. And it's hard to. For gut-directed hypnotherapy, large observational cohorts, including a recent audit of 1,000 adult patients and small randomized controlled trials with suboptimal placebo arms, have suggested global reductions of gastrointestinal symptoms in the majority of IBS patients. So they cite 4 different studies, and there is research to show. And again, just put on a calming gut hypnotherapy on Spotify or YouTube, or put on these calming vibrations and take deep breaths. You will feel better in a lot of your symptoms. However, that's part of the equation, as we'll get to. But an alternative approach is to compare the efficacy against that of an intervention with high levels of evidence. So rather than compare hypnotherapy to doing nothing, they want to compare it to the low FODMAP diet. The low FODMAP diet benefits all symptoms in a proportion of patients with IBS, regardless of bowel habit and subtype, so whether IBS-D or IBS-C or A. And the recent meta-analysis of multiple studies, including reevaluation of raw data, indicated that a high level of evidence for its efficacy has been published. Additionally, randomized controlled trials indicating the efficacy of the low FODMAP diet compared with diets higher in FODMAPs have since been published as well. So hence, the gut-directed hypnotherapy was compared to the low FODMAP diet in patients naive to both therapies on the effects of gastrointestinal symptoms. So this is really speaking to people that have never done the low FODMAP diet, people who have never done gut hypnotherapy, which half the people in the study that didn't apply to. And psychological indices concerning anxiety and depression and quality of life were measured. So since the approaches are thought to be quite different in mechanism of action, which is true, it was anticipated they would have additive effects, that one would be, if you had 2, because one is calming you, the other one is calming the gas, theoretically 2 should be better than 1. But the results of the current randomized trial show that both therapies are efficacious to similar degree and have durable benefits, but no signs of additive effect were evident. So they didn't find that it was better to do both. With the exception of an improvement in anxiety at 6 months in the low FODMAP diet-treated arm, gut-directed hypnotherapy appeared to have a superior effect on positively modulating psychological indices in the long term. The comparative therapy, the low FODMAP diet, showed efficacy in a similar proportion of patients, about 70%, as similarly reported in previous observational and randomized studies. The durability of this response, previously reported in prospective observational cohort, has been confirmed. That's when you follow people for a long period over time, from day 1 to 10 years later, and you see how people do, which is really a helpful way of understanding how different practices can impact your health. However, the actual dietary behavior of patients taught the low FODMAP diet by a dietitian has not been previously reported. Few patients remained on the strict FODMAP restriction that was recommended as initial therapy. This was likely to be attributable to the reintroduction program, directed by the dietitian so the patients could liberalize their diets, yet still continue to have symptomatic benefit. The interpretation of these data, however, is limited given the disparity in the reintroduction phase between participants who may have individual FODMAP thresholds. So it's pretty hard to reintroduce FODMAPs. It takes working with a professional, somebody who's been there and gone through it, and we don't specifically treat people through a low FODMAP diet approach, but we do understand that the foods that traditionally people have eaten, look at dietas In the Amazon, they eat quinoa, they eat zucchini, they eat cucumbers, they're eating a little bit of tomato. They're eating sometimes light dishes during these dietas that calm the gut so that they can work one-on-one with the food and understand whether the plant can be used to support them and in what way, right? So it's a very long-term practice. This FODMAP diet was just developed in 2000, I think, or very recently. So, this practices of calming down your gut, calming down the gas foods, like when you're in the Buddhist monasteries and they don't cook garlic and onion because they say it makes you quick to anger, quick to rage. They're tuning into the fact that you can take out certain FODMAPs, reduce the gas, and help people feel a lot more calm in their bodies. So what they found is gut-directed hypnotherapy achieved almost identical rates of response at the end of the 6-month follow-up as the low FODMAP diet. Likewise, quality of life similarly improved. This is great news, and I think amazing for anyone who's wondering, breathing and meditating and listening to calming music and having, it's not just the meditation and the music, it's having people walk you through different guided meditations, maybe, clenching your fist and letting it go, clenching your shoulder and letting it go, and just calming your body completely has also been shown to be supportive for IBS as well. But so there, they say there's several reasons here, but and I don't want to read the entire study. It'll take me a while, but there's basically evidence to say that gut-directed hypnotherapy can be very helpful in calming symptoms, and I'm all on board with that. And there's evidence to say that understanding your FODMAPs, understanding that if you look up high FODMAPs and just eat all of them in one meal, most people will be in a lot of pain. And most people that don't have IBS will be in pain. One of the reasons that they mentioned in the study that it's possible that doing both didn't have an additive effect is that by the end of the study, people's stomach actually felt normal and similar to those that were not diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome. So it's possible that they got to a point where there would not be additive benefit because you're at the normal feeling that most people have in their stomach. Most people, when they eat foods that are unhealthy for them, will feel a little bit bad in their stomach, I think. Um, Feeling in pain 24/7 is a different story. And that's something that, again, it really helps me to see a more holistic picture, right? Because we're told you've just got to take this drug, you just have to do this diet, and we see that, the colors around here, the butterflies, the leaves falling, the sounds, the smells, like these all contribute to how we're feeling on a daily basis. So I want to leave you with that holistic picture. And that's why the whole health method that we use doesn't employ just one thing, just the low FODMAP diet, right? We don't just do hypnotherapy or, meditative practices. We want to understand from you, what your biggest struggles are, how we can support you in eating more of these whole plant healthful foods so that your microbiome and your gut can actually grow, right? And no matter where you're at, you can probably grow your microbiome, but it can't be at the same speed that I go. It can't be at the same speed that another woman goes at. You need to go at the right pace for you. So that's why it can be scary. It can be confusing to do this alone. You're not alone. If you need some support, we've got a link down below. You can just click that link and set up a time to chat, and we can see where you're at, where you'd like to go, and maybe if we're a good fit, if we can support you on that journey. Because it doesn't have to take, I'm talking with women that have said they've been struggling with this for 10 years. 20 years, it doesn't have to take that long. You don't have to go get a master's in public health and learn the literature. You can just tune in, you can get support, and you can learn the research for what we're sharing here today. So hope you found this helpful. If you did, give it a comment, give it a like, give it a share, give it to a friend who's curious and interested in different ways they can help their gut calm down. So in the end, my overall takeaway is that I'm going to be doing plenty of gut-directed hypnotherapy. I'm playing the handpan, I'm recording soothing recordings for my clients so you don't have to hear an advertisement every single time you're listening to hypnotherapy. Happens a lot on Spotify. They got great content, but there is an ad there. So if you want some of that information, some recordings that are just for you, we work with women that are doing sound healings, and I'm also really enjoying playing music myself. So if you are musically talented, if you do that, I encourage you to get back into singing, get back into the music when you put the guitar down because you were in pain, when you stop singing. And if you don't play music, that's okay. Just listen to some calming tunes. Tune into your body, take deep breaths, and notice how you're feeling. So I hope you found this helpful. I love sharing this research with you, and the reason I brought my computer out is it's so hard to actually remember what was said without it right in front of me. So wishing you a really great day. Let's end with a deep breath. Have a great night.